Well, indeed, those countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Qatar, do have very close relations with Britain. So Britain does have a very important role to play in actually exposing to the international community the role that those countries are playing in exporting and encouraging religious terrorism. And the former Home Secretary, David Blunkett, is absolutely correct when he accuses them of actually supporting, in more ways than one, Islamic State, or IS, as it's more commonly known as. And what we have to bear in mind is that Saudi Arabia in particular, hasn't just started supporting religious extremist groups in the last few years in Syria. For the last 30 years, Saudi Arabia has been the leading exporter of religious extremism and terrorism to the world. They were doing that in Afghanistan in the 1980s against the Russians. They were present in Bosnia during the civil war in the early 1990s, and they've been continuing since then. So Britain, yes, has close political, economic and trade relations with Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Kuwait, but at the same time it must act on how Saudi Arabia in particular is responsible for pretty much all the terrorist attacks of a religious nature which have occurred across the world, from Washington to New York to London to Madrid to Bali to Damascus. All those cases where there was an Islamist terrorist attack have a signpost pointing back to Saudi Arabia. Well, Britain has very close ties to Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Kuwait. There's a lot of ties when it comes to oil, but also Britain is a big exporter of military equipment to these countries. But so Britain is in that situation where on the one hand, it benefits immensely from having ties to those countries, but on the other hand, it's suffering. As I said, nearly 10 years ago, the London bombings, there was a signpost. There's ample evidence to suggest that the root of that was Saudi Arabia and probably as well Kuwait and Qatar. So Britain, along with other countries in the West, and let's not forget that, it's not just Britain that has close relations to those countries, America in particular, but also France. So Britain, but indeed the rest of the West, has actually got to prioritise. It's got to decide: is the British government there, and the American government there, and the French government there to protect its interests at home and abroad, to protect the well-being of its people at home and abroad, or does it want to simply benefit in a financial sense from its relations with those countries? There's got to have a balance. Sure, you can trade with countries, but if those countries are actually exporting an ideology, in Saudi Arabia's case, Wahhabism, and that's actually responsible for terrorist acts in Western capitals, then firm and decisive action has got to be taken against those countries. It's a cancer, and you've got to cut that cancer out. The whole irony of the West's position on Syria is that it actually has created the turmoil, the bloody turmoil that we see in Syria today. It's actually paved the way for various Islamist groups, including IS, not just to threaten the region, but also to threaten the wider world as well. Because the Americans, the British and the French, together with the Saudis and the Qataris and the Kuwaitis, they weakened the Syrian government so much that they created the ground, they created the environment for various Islamist groups to emerge. And IS is just one of those. The FSA is an Islamist group. Islamic Front is an Islamist group. Al-Nusra is an Islamist group. So there's no such thing as moderates. They are all extremists. They all pose a threat to the to Syria, which is a secular, multicultural, and progressive country. So there can be no differentiating between terrorists. Terrorism is terrorism, and a terrorist is a terrorist. If we're told, as we're told, the FSA are not extremists, why is it they carried out terrible atrocities and terrible damage in various Christian towns and villages across Syria, for example, Malula? So they're not moderates, they are extremists, and the international community has got to sit down and label all those Islamist groups in Syria as extremists, as a menace, not just to the region, but to the wider world, and to decide how to deal with them. But unfortunately, the West has created the situation that we see today in Syria, and it's going to backfire, just as to how the West's support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s came to backfire on the West, most brutally, of course, on 9/11.